grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returneth, was not spoken of the soul.
A story can be told. A story can be told of how modern education
speak to one another and look at how they have built the systems to deeply love one another where they're at.
He said, you know that you're more than a bird because God will send people to love you. And from preschool to law school, God always sent people like you to love me.
A good education is one that ultimately gives the individual an opportunity to flourish as an adult, irrespective of where life's journey takes them.
We're not just giving them knowledge either. We're also trying to develop them morally. We're trying to develop them into something other than what they are now, so that they can go out into the world later and be somebody.
I am glad for my heart. I am glad for my heart.
Our work today is to engage our time with the resources that we have, to be hopeful, forward-looking, and to know that the lessons of the past are ours to be prudently deployed for generations of students ahead. Brothers and sisters, we have an essential part to play in an unfinished history. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Please come in and take your seats. I want to begin by saying, is everybody settling in? I want to begin by saying that Friday morning at Symposium is always bittersweet. We have immersed ourselves in the subject of classical education in the American experiment, listened to innumerable keynote speakers, participated in multiple workshops, met up with old friends and made new acquaintances. And so now we only have a few more hours of Symposium before we wrap up and start to work again on next year's Symposium. There's only just a very small, I think I'll probably sleep tonight and then maybe start again on Monday. So, but I want to just reiterate my gratitude for everyone who puts aside a few days to join us in this rich and vibrant community, all dedicated to educational excellence in the classical world, educating students to become future citizens, to become future leaders, and to become serious, educated human beings. I have also just a couple of thanks that I want to offer while people are still coming in. I just want to reiterate my thanks to the entire Great Hearts team. Big events like this don't happen with just one or two people up on the stage. It takes a small army of volunteers. The Great Hearts leadership, Helen Baxendale, Jake Tawney, Geraldine Olson, Dan Scoggin. It takes our small but mighty Great Hearts Institute team, Annie Matsuda, Jennifer Richter, Shannon McQuitty, our interns this year have been amazing. And it takes a slightly larger army of Great Hearts volunteers who come in and manage the registration table at the front. They help us sort of stuff the bags, the symposium bags with all the various items, and they moderate sessions. We're just so lucky to have a wonderful community of people dedicated to making this symposium a great success. So please give everyone. Let me also just offer a couple of reminders. I want to remind you that this is the best time to get the earliest rate. This rate at $397 for symposium for next year is the lowest rate that we're going to have, and you have it for an entire week. It's available until March 9th. And you don't have to know who's coming. You can just register a certain number of people, and we'll fill in the names when you have them. But we just want to let you know that you're here, you're dedicated, so we want to let you know that this rate is available for symposiusts who are on the spot. So please use the QR code. There's also a QR code at the back of the program that you can access. Stop someone at the registration table if you have any further questions. But please join us for our symposium next year, the theme of which will be Recovering Reading and Reason in a Distracted Age. Let me also remind you to complete the survey. We have, at the end of symposium every year, we put up a survey. You can access it through your app on the phone, and we've put up signs everywhere. You can't actually open a door without seeing the QR code for the survey. We would love to know how we did. Tell us how we did. Tell us what you'd like to see next year. And please also consider submitting your own proposals. The portal will be open also soon, and we are excited every year now to see the proposals that come in. We can only accept a certain number of them, but we're very excited to have outside voices contributing to symposium. So please do the survey. Let us know your thoughts. We want to make symposium as excellent as we can for all of you who come so far to participate with us in this great conversation. And now let me bring up our talent for this morning. I'd like to introduce Carolyn Schubring. Carolyn is a composer, improvising pianist, and educator whose work centers around stirring up the creativity of her audiences. A 2016 graduate of Great Hearts Chandler Preparatory Academy, she studied music composition and piano performance at the University of Michigan, where she premiered her own piano concerto as a soloist. Her compositions have earned recognition from prestigious organizations, including the Music Teachers National Association, American Composers Forum, American Composers Orchestra, the American Society of Composers, Authors and Publishers, and NPR's From the Top. Please welcome Carolyn to the stage.
Just a brief note, what I'll be playing today is a medley of American music I hope you'll recognize and enjoy. Since we're talking about the American experiment, consider this the American sound experiment, traveling through time and all the composers figuring out what does America sound like.
Okay, is everyone fired up now? Carolyn, thank you for that composition. That was amazing. And that was a tour de force, so just in a few minutes. Thank you so much for putting that together for us. I just loved it. And before I introduce our keynote speaker in just a minute, I just wanted to just say thank you, Dr. Carol McNamara, for the party you've thrown for the last couple of days. Carol is a model of grit and grace, intelligence and energy, all wound into one. I know there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that is stressful, but you just carry yourself with so much grace. And the 364 days before this day, all the work that you put in, it's so good. For all of us at Great Hearts and all of our friends around the country, you're an amazing hostess. God bless you. Thank you. So our final keynote address, really excited to introduce Dr. Barndt in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to thank our sponsor today for this keynote, Chris Perrin, Classical Academic Press, which is such a force in the movement. Classical Academic Press is a classical education curriculum, media, and consulting company. We are the product, they are the product of years of brainstorming, conversation, thoughtful critiques, and application in public, private, and charter schools and homeschool classrooms. Their mission is to produce and supply to today's classical market the finest curricula and resources available. Their motto, classical subjects creatively taught, describes the essence of all that they publish: Latin, logic, writing and rhetoric, grammar, Greek, Spanish, poetry, literature guides, and more. They seek to produce classical curricula and media with a clear design and structure to incremental and systematic instruction, all with a touch of delight and joy, creativity and flair. Learning should be fun and beautiful. So thank you to Classical Academic Press. Our keynote speaker, thank you so much for being with us today, Susan. Susan McWilliams Barndt is a professor of politics at Pomona College and also the William F. Podlick Distinguished Fellows in Government at Claremont McKenna College. So one college is not enough for you. So you have, that is amazing. So they're both in the Claremont College system in Southern California. She serves as the elected president of the American Political Thought section of the American Political Sciences Association. McWilliams is the author of The American Road Trip, An American Political Thought, and Traveling Back Toward a Global Political Theory. She's also the editor of A Political Companion to James Baldwin and a co-editor of several books, including The Best Kind of College, An Insider's Guide to Small American Liberal Arts Colleges. I want to read that one. That sounds wonderful. And The Princeton History of American Political Thought, which is coming out soon. McWilliams is also the co-editor of the American Political Thought book series at the University Press in Kansas and a past editor of the peer-reviewed journal American Political Thought. Her writing has appeared in both scholarly and popular journals, and she is a regular media commentator on American politics for outlets such as The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, Miss Magazine, The Nation, Fox News, the New York Times, and LA on KNBC. For her work, McWilliams has received accolades including the Graves Award in the Humanities, a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, and the Jack Miller Center's Teaching Excellence Award in Higher Education. McWilliams holds a BA in Political Science and Russian, wonderful, from Amherst College, and an MA and PhD in Politics from Princeton University, and a certificate in Advanced Education from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. Colleagues and friends, join me in welcoming Dr. Susan McWilliams Barndt to the stage.
Oh, it's so great to be here. And Carolyn, that was amazing. I kind of think I'd like to listen to an hour of that rather than an hour of myself. We don't do music enough at events like these. Individual voices could have pulled off by themselves, which is, of course, the goal of civic life as well, and the goal of the nation that we all inhabit today. Anyway, that was terrific. I'm also grateful to Carol and everybody at Great Hearts for all their work in putting this symposium together. I got invited to come here and talk last year, and I had such a good time that literally on the cab to the airport, I started scheming about how I could get invited back for this year. And the topic for next year sounds amazing. So my scheming is already going to begin later today. I hope yours will as well. Okay, so the cover of this very fine symposium brochure and of the slides behind me invites us to honor one of the most important days in American history, perhaps the most important day in American history. And so, in honor of the theme of this conference, I want to tell you a story. And it's a story about what happened in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. But I'm not going to tell you the story that you think I'm going to tell, or the story that all of you know about what happened on July 4th, 1776. I'm not going to tell you the story of how on that day the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Rather, I'm going to tell you the story about what happened immediately after the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Because even if these events haven't been captured in paintings or in history books, what happened next tells us a lot about why we are here today and how the enterprise of classical education connects to the American founding and the American experiment. Okay, so it's the afternoon of July 4th, 1776. Now, I think about this a lot because you might think that after pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the nation whose independence they had just declared, the members of the Continental Congress might have, taken a few minutes to celebrate, right? Like they were all drinkers. They might have gone, to a tavern and toasted the newly asserted republic and celebrated the United States. They might have adjourned for the day and gone home. They might have paused even for a few minutes like we do at this conference all the time for a nice midday snack. And by the way, the snacks at this conference are super on point. But the founders didn't do anything like that, nothing nearly so exciting or celebratory. Instead, just moments after approving the Declaration, the Continental Congress appointed a committee. This committee's job was to design a great seal for the newly asserted republic, the picture that would adorn lecterns like this one for as long as the nation might live. Okay, the three members of this committee were some of the biggest names of the Revolution. You'll have heard of all of them: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. As some of you know, they weren't just big names in general. All three of them had been on the committee of five that drafted the Declaration. The Declaration is their combined work. So, as committee assignments go, and I want to say, as a faculty member, I know a lot about committee assignments. I suspect some of you do as well. As far as committee assignments go, this seems like a relatively fun one, right? Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson are basically charged with drawing a picture. And it's a picture that would visually represent what the Declaration of Independence and the new American nation were all about. After the fraught discussions that these men had just held, right? After all the work that they had taken, all the numbers of drafts that they went through to get the ideals of this nation down on paper, after the anxious moments that they had surely endured just to get unanimity on a Declaration of Independence, designing a great seal must have seemed like a pretty simple and straightforward task, right? It's like your reward for writing the Declaration of Independence. But within weeks, the committee members were locked in a terrible battle. Benjamin Franklin insisted that the Great Seal had to show a picture. Here's his picture of Moses. These are his words. Moses standing on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who is sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand, raised from a pillar of fire in the clouds, reaching to Moses to express that he acts by command of the deity. In other words, Franklin insisted that the Great Seal of the United States show a picture from the story of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. Now, Thomas Jefferson, not so much a religious believer, thought that was basically the most terrible idea he had ever heard. Franklin's idea was entirely inappropriate, he thought, because Jefferson thought it was clear that the Great Seal should show a picture of the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. In other words, Jefferson insisted that the Great Seal of the United States show a different picture from the story of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. We know about this fight, by the way, because John Adams is like writing home to Abigail and being like, I don't know what to do with these guys. Like, he proposes like something that doesn't involve the story of Exodus, and they're like, what are you talking about? This is clearly Exodus business. Anyway, so the fight between Franklin and Jefferson never got resolved. They could not resolve the disagreement. Adams tried to negotiate, like I said, he couldn't do it. They brought in a local graphic designer, and he proposed like some stuff, and Franklin and Jefferson were like, no, it's Exodus or bust, and right. So nobody liked those ideas. The Continental Congress would table the committee's report. The nation's first experiment with governance by a committee was a failed one. Maybe telling for governance by committee in general. But even though that committee failed in its task, its failure helps reveal what I want to talk about today. For I don't think it's hard to see what's interesting about the Franklin and Jefferson proposals, conflicting though they might have been. These two children of the modern Enlightenment offered their first chance to depict the American political liberty they had just declared in writing, looked not to the modern Enlightenment, but to the ancient Exodus story. Now, that Jefferson and Franklin might both, in this very crucial moment, turn to the Exodus story shouldn't be entirely surprising. By the 1770s, the Exodus story had long had a central place in American self-understanding. It's well known that the Puritans considered themselves less a New England than a New Israel. They understood their journey, as the preacher Samuel Danforth put it in an Election Day sermon in 1670, to be an errand into the wilderness. For the Puritans, that errand echoed the wandering of the ancient Israelites as they came to terms with the duties and demands of being a chosen people. Like the ancient Israelites, the Puritans believed they had entered into a covenant with God, a covenant that promised to move them from the bondage of an old world into the freedom of a new. And this is, if you don't know it, this is the Monument to the Forefathers in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which lists pieces of the story of Exodus in honor of the first settlers of New England. The Exodus theme was so pervasive in New England that by the Revolutionary era, its imprint upon American culture can hardly be overstated. Though perhaps Franklin and Jefferson's disagreement, taking place entirely within the terms of the Exodus story, is statement enough. Or you could visit the Liberty Bell, which tells us to, quote, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, which are the words that God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Or, if you're a political scientist like me, you could consult Donald Lutz's epic survey of political citations in the early Republic. I want to say, Donald Lutz, who I've never met, I don't know where he worked, but in the 1980s, when we didn't have digital access to stuff, somehow got his hands on basically every piece of public writing during the founding era and counted the citations to sources. And this heroic feat on Donald Lutz's part revealed that by far the most cited book during that period of American history was the Book of Deuteronomy, with citations of the Exodus story far outnumbering citations of Enlightenment thinkers. They collectively, you add up Locke, you add up Montesquieu, you put all the Europeans of the Enlightenment you can think of, they collectively rank a distant second. Collectively. Now, some scholars, especially today, have explained Exodus's prevalence in the early Republic as a mere expression of hope for divine support or as a mere rhetorical strategy to engage a biblically literate populace. I think those explanations are both fair but partial. For American states, in which Langdon uses the Exodus story to illustrate the dependence of liberalism on constitutionalism. Langdon, for what it's worth, was once the president of Harvard College. He would go on as a leader in New Hampshire to play a key role in securing the Constitution's adoption. Or consider one of my favorite guys, Nathaniel Niles's 1774 Two Discourses on Liberty, in which Niles uses the Israelites to exemplify civil liberty and the collective nature of civil liberty. Niles would go on to become a member of the Vermont House of Representatives, a justice of that state's Supreme Court, and one of 7 US congressmen to vote against the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. Or consider that in 1777, John Adams worried to Benjamin Rush that the Continental Congress was making George Washington into a golden calf. One of many worries at the time about flesh pots and false idols, the temptations that Exodus identifies as destructive to projects of liberation. As these cases suggest, the key conversations about freedom and independence in the early Republic happened, as in the debate between Franklin and Jefferson, within the terms of the Exodus story. How does a people move from servitude to self-government? What principles and practices do a people need to adopt to become a free people? What dangers attend the road to political freedom? How do you set up a government, and how do you set up laws that preserve collective freedom? Or in the terms of the Exodus story, how does a new Israel avoid turning into a new Egypt? These are the questions that Americans in the late 1700s were asking, and they found much of their guidance in the Exodus story. And I can guarantee you, because I've been on this journey for a couple years now, once you start looking for references to the Exodus story in the early American Republic and in the American founding, you see them everywhere. Now today, most American students, I think most Americans period, don't see those references at all and wouldn't know what to make of them if they did. Increasing unfamiliarity with the Hebrew Bible and with other classic texts makes it harder and harder for Americans to understand our origins, our institutions, and our cultural practices and peculiarities. In the United States, the decline of classical education has exacerbated a decline of civic education, as students lose their ability to track the stories, the characters, and the ideas that long grounded and still ground the Republic. Today, most of us are able to read the words, but miss the meanings. We can see the notes, but we cannot hear the music. In other words, classical illiteracy begets civic illiteracy. Now, given the symposium we are at today, I think I can safely bet that you're on board with the general argument. But I want to use the place of the Exodus in the early Republic to offer some more pointed examples about what can get lost as a civic matter in the United States when we fail to attend to classical matters. So, back to the 1700s. When a young Revolutionary War veteran and poet turned pastor named Lemuel Haynes was so inspired by the Declaration of Independence that he began writing political treatises alongside his sermons. And a big part of what inspired Haynes and what brought him to political writing was the connection he saw immediately between the principles of the Declaration and the ancient Exodus story. Haynes exhorted his readers to become active citizens because the example of the Israelites teaches us, he said, that it is our duty to become acquainted with the laws of the land and to engage them, especially if we want to achieve collective freedom. But Haynes wasn't just thinking of any freedom here. He was thinking of the freedom of enslaved Americans. He was thinking of abolition. Haynes himself was, as perhaps some of you know, though you probably don't, Lemuel Haynes is the single most neglected person in the founding generation. Haynes was the first African American to be ordained as a minister of a largely white congregation in the United States. He would also become the first African American to receive an honorary degree from an American university. In other words, he was regarded as one of the most important thinkers in the founding generation by other people in the founding generation. In any case, as soon as Haynes read the Declaration, he understood it to be an engine of America's own Exodus story, a step on the road to the Promised Land. In his 1776 essay, Liberty Further Extended, Haynes lays it out. Slavery, he says, is repugnant to the law which was given to the children of Israel. And as the Declaration holds these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, we can conclude, he writes, that every African has equally as good a right to his liberty, in common with Englishmen. The story of Lemuel Haynes is pretty wonderful on its own terms, but it also indicates some of the grander terms of our enterprise. For one thing, when you trace classical sources in American texts, you often find that new voices, neglected voices, what in my line of work we call subaltern voices, come to the fore. You find thinkers who have been neglected by latter-day historians. You find new lines of cultural lineage and tradition. You find new ways of thinking about what constitutes the legacy of the American founding and the American political tradition. In this case, when you trace the uses of the Exodus story in American history, you'll find pretty quickly that Lemuel Haynes is not an outlier, far from it. Especially in the wake of the Declaration, the Exodus story became the engine of African American political thought. To paraphrase the historian Albert Rabbitoe, if whites saw America as the new Israel, blacks knew that it was the new Egypt. African American leaders, starting in the 18th century, ritualized the Exodus story in order to provide an account of the condition of Black Americans, to articulate the promise and possibility of human liberty, and to articulate the moral and political stances required to achieve and maintain that liberty, even when the odds seemed stacked against this realization, and in terms that were legible to America's founding documents. In the early Republic, the Exodus story was the central reference point for African American thought. For early leaders of the AME Church, such as Richard Allen, the Exodus story did more than provide resonant biblical imagery. It allowed them to make explicit political critiques, especially of slavery. It also enabled a broader theoretical framing of discrete political events, such as in Absalom Jones's Thanksgiving sermon, which is focused on Exodus 3. Jones delivered that sermon on January 1st, 1808, the day that you all know the transatlantic slave trade ended, and he locates that day within a larger liberal project outlined in the Exodus story. But Exodus imagery also dominated African American imagination beyond sermons in this period. From Phyllis Wheatley's poems, to Caesar Sartor's essay on slavery, to slave spirituals like Go Down Moses, and I like this title, Didn't Old Pharaoh Get Lost? The Exodus story articulated an African American sense of peoplehood and pointed toward the possibility of collective liberation. The Exodus story also provided standards by which other American visions of liberty could be interrogated. Maybe some of you have read or encountered David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which is a clear example of this. He's like, too many Americans think that liberty is this thing that this guy John Locke talks about, but it's not. True American liberty is Exodus liberty. There are many other examples. What's even more telling about the dominance of the Exodus story during the antebellum period is that even those African American leaders who took issue with it, such as the influential Henry Highland Garnett, felt compelled to speak within its terms. In arguing that, quote, it is impossible to make a grand exodus from the land of bondage because the pharaohs are on both sides of the blood-red waters, he's quite a poet. Garnett's rejection of Exodus politics still depends on Exodus imagery. Even after the Civil War, in both the North and the South, the Exodus story remained a key reference point for African American political thought and action. From Benjamin Pap Singleton and his Kansas Exodusters, to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's Victorian politics, as expressed perhaps most clearly in her poem Moses, to W.E.B. Du Bois's sociological account of African Americans as wearied Israelites, to Frederick Douglass's observation that by wisely using the Exodus example, African Americans can easily exact better terms for their labor than ever before. I could keep going all the way up to the present, but I think you get the idea. And the idea is this. Tracking the Exodus story allows you to see a clear, coherent, consistent tradition of African American political thought that they understood, and I think we should understand. Tradition of African American political thought is the tradition most true to the events of July 4th, 1776, and represents the true legacy of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, let me jump to the present. Today, critiques of classical education. I know I don't need to tell you this. Yeah, isn't that great? Today, critiques of classical education are often made in the name of inclusion and racial diversity. One prominent educational leader says, for instance, he said this a couple weeks ago, that there is a centuries-long tradition of white Americans abusing classics to justify enslavement and, by extension, to promulgate anti-Black racism. He continues to describe a history of intentional, overt white supremacy within classical education. Intentional, overt white supremacy within classical education. Now, that critique may be overstated, but it's not entirely wrong. Plenty of Americans and non-Americans have abused classical texts to support, implicitly and explicitly, claims of racial superiority. I know we all condemn such abuses. I know that in this room we all understand that just because a thing has been or could be abused to evil ends does not mean we should condemn the thing itself, right? People have many times used hammers to kill people in the past. I could use a hammer to kill my department chair. Don't tell them that I said that. But we all understand. But we all understand. You all have people like that in your lives. But we all understand that the hammer's association with or potentiality for evil action does not mean that we should consign all our hammers to the dustbins of history. Still, I think that even in this room, we should all try to be sympathetic to the reasons that some of our fellow Americans and many of our fellow educators are gun-shy when it comes to the classics on this count. Their apprehensions, I think, are understandable. I get it when some of my students come to college assuming that classical texts have nothing to say to them. I get it why some of my colleagues assume the same thing. I get why the teacher at my son's middle school, a school where white students make up less than a quarter of the student body, are inclined to replace classic books with contemporary novels as they work earnestly to make all their students feel spoken to in the curriculum. But considering the Exodus tradition in American politics exposes the paradox, and I think the irony, maybe even the tragedy, of that conventional thinking. Because in this case, to work through the classic text, to work through its place in American life, is to work through a tradition that actually centers African American thinkers in this nation's history. It is by tending to this classic source that you can demarginalize Black political thought and bring it to the foreground of our national conversation. I mean, as a side note here too, I think teaching the Exodus story is a good example about how scripture is different from religion. We can teach students to read scriptural texts in ways that are not like religiously evangelizing. One of the things that's striking about so many of the uses of Exodus as a story in American political history is that so often the Exodus story is marshaled by people like Franklin and Jefferson, who weren't really religious believers at all, and so often used by African American thinkers of whom you could say the same thing. The same African American thinkers who were sometimes suspicious of the imposition of Christianity onto slave populations in particular still use the Exodus story as a vehicle for political conversation. In those ways, I think the example of the Exodus tradition helps to show, in a very visible way, something bigger about the way that classical texts have figured in American life. Throughout our nation's history, it's in conversations about, or fights over, or reinterpretations of classical texts that great political debates have taken place, and foundational political critiques have taken place. I want to give you just 3 examples that are kind of outside the bounds of the Exodus story, and very different examples. The first, Spike Lee's movie Chirac, which is his retelling of Aristophanes' Lysistrata. It's a masterful critique, if you haven't seen it, by the way, of gang violence in Chicago and state inaction in the face of such violence. Here's another. I'm teaching a course on Herman right now, so I always like to think about Herman Melville's Moby Dick. It plays upon the Book of Jonah to criticize both American slavery and imperialism. And by the way, my students come to college not knowing anything about the Book of Jonah, so we have to read that first to be able to understand what the heck Melville is doing. If you can't read the classical text, you have no idea what the resonance, what the play on the classical source is. And here's another example. Northwestern University professor Sarah Moniston has documented at length that during the Cold War McCarthy era, many creative artists found ways to depict Socrates in television and film in order to offer accounts of the demands of democratic citizenship that competed with prevailing accounts of the day and lodged subtle but pointed critiques of the blacklisting culture that was taking over, particularly the entertainment industry. In other words, in American civics education, it's often best through the classics that we can appreciate what I take to be the central nature of American political thought, that it is an enduring conversation and contestation over a set of central terms and principles. I also believe that to be able to engage meaningfully in that conversation, to be engaged fully as a citizen or as a member of this republic, you have to both know the central terms and principles and know the referential text over which these conversations and contestations have occurred. I can put a finer point on it too, or approach it in a slightly different way. Throughout American history, classical works, reuses of classical works, plays on classical works, have often been what my fellow political scientist James C. Scott calls weapons of the weak, marshaled and deployed by people far outside the halls of power in order to make claims on power, often in subtle and indirect, but still very formidable ways. Today, I think, when we neglect to teach students the classics, we are not just depriving them of the wisdom of the books themselves. We are also dispossessing them of their civic inheritance, depriving them both of historical knowledge and of the intellectual tools that Americans have so often used to seek and articulate demands for justice. Now, I'm going to be clear, most of what I'm saying here is not new. W.E.B. Du Bois said most of it better in the early 1900s when he championed classical education for African Americans. As I'm sure you know, he argued particularly against Booker T. Washington's vision of more technical vocational training, that classical education is essential for intellectual liberation, leadership development, and the achievement of full citizenship. These are surely some of the greatest lines that have ever been written in the English language, so I'm going to read them to you and also make you look at them. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing beneath the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they all come graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull, red hideousness of Georgia? Are you so afraid lest peering from this high Pisgah, between Philistine and Amalekite, we sight the promised land? Certain old things, as we all know, bear repeating. I think they especially bear repeating today. For today, it is the ironic, tragic truth that the very educators who shelve classic texts because they hope to empower their students, and especially to empower their students as change makers, which, as you all know, is one of the trendy words of the day. It's a word I particularly hate. That those very same educators are in many ways disempowering those students to those very ends. Most of those students do not and will not know exactly how they have been dispossessed, but they will feel the nation itself. One of the signal elements of the ancient Exodus story is its emphasis on the importance of storytelling. The ancient Israelites are brought to learn, through their wanderings in the wilderness, that liberty and self-government are never fully achieved in a moment. The search for political liberty, the search for justice, the search for law and equality under the law don't happen quickly. You don't become fully free or self-governing just because your chains have come off. You don't become fully free or self-governing just because you make a declaration that you wish it to be so. You don't become fully free or self-governing just because you establish a set of laws. You don't become fully free or self-governing overnight or even over a single human lifetime. The achievement of political freedom and self-governance the Exodus story teaches is a project that unfolds over many lifetimes. It is a necessarily multi-generational affair, one that those who come first or earlier entrust to those who come after. It's the job of those who come earlier to leave stories behind for their inheritors, to help light their way through the wilderness and into a promised land of freedom and self-government that they could not achieve in their own time and could only slightly imagine. It is the job of those who inherit those stories to honor their predecessors by taking those stories seriously, by retelling them, by revisiting them, and by reworking them in the continued pursuit of liberty and in the continued pursuit of justice. If we lose touch with the historical story, if we fail to read and think about and repeat the stories that were passed down to us, we lose touch with our shared patrimony. As Danielle Allen says, Declaration is our shared patrimony. The stories that animate it are our shared patrimony. But if we fail to tell the stories, we lose touch with that patrimony, and we lose touch with the multi-generational story that is our shared patrimony. And in doing so, we lose touch not only with our history, but with the sense that we have a collectivity and a collective stake in our political future. I think that's a lesson that we would all do well to remember today. The United States didn't become fully free or self-governing on July 4th, 1776. When my daughter was in 4th grade, she came home one day and was like, I don't see why we celebrate July 4th. It was just a bunch of dudes saying what they wanted, but they didn't actually get it yet. From the mouths of babes. She's right. The men who wrote and ratified the Declaration of Independence knew that they hadn't, in fact, achieved a free nation on that date. I think often of the fact, when I'm thinking about the Exodus story in the founding, that although Franklin and Jefferson disagreed about the specific scenes they wanted to depict on that seal, neither man chose to depict the ancient Israelites having reached or even having neared the promised land. They both wanted to show the Israelites on their way, their journey still incomplete, their freedom declared but as yet unrealized, still with many steps on the road ahead. So it was 250 years ago, and so it remains today. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. That was amazing. And, you know, What I'd like to do is just offer a couple introductory questions to Susan, but we do have the mic set up here, so be thinking of your questions. She would love to take questions from the audience in just a few minutes. So get ready to come on up and think of those. So with the decline in scripture reading today, do you think the Exodus story has the same force in circles that it did during the Puritan era and the American founding?
Well, it definitely doesn't have the same force it did in the Puritan era. They read the Old Testament all the time and talked about it all the time. That's not the culture quite that we inhabit now. But I do note that once my students have read the Exodus story, when I started teaching Intro to Political Philosophy, I didn't teach biblical texts at all. And then I realized that my students just couldn't understand so much of what subsequently happened, even in like Enlightenment thinking. But once they read the story, they started coming to me and saying, wait a minute, the Prince of Egypt is the Exodus story, right? Right? Wait a minute. And so my students, I started to do an assignment, in fact, where I would say, take one of the sources in this class and find one of the remixes in contemporary American culture. And it's a kind of fun assignment because even though I think I see these kind of like legacies and stories everywhere, students find them all over the place and in surprising places, in hip hop lyrics, in movies, in television shows. So while I don't think, like many things in this culture, we certainly don't have, right, the strength of scriptural knowledge and conversation that the Puritans had for sure, or even that people in the 1770s did. But those legacies are still there, and those connections are still there. And when you open students' eyes to them, it helps to connect the present to the past, frankly, and to make you realize that though so much about our life circumstances has changed, right, the technology that's enabling this whole conference wasn't available in the 1770s, but the central ideas and themes and questions remain the same.
That's great. Was there a distinct difference, Susan, between how the Puritans read Exodus and the founders? It seems like, obviously, rebellion, pushing back against unlegitimate authority, freedom, but it seems like it was a different context, the 140, 50 years that separated them. So can you highlight some of the differences in the reading?
I'm sure, and I think that's good. One of the things that I always point out to my students, I'm like, there's a long time between 1620 and 1770, right? Like, just as to you, 150 years ago is like an unimaginable length of time in the past. And you know, the Puritans changed, their understandings changed, their schisms. There's nothing that radical Protestants like more than a schismatic controversy. And so I do think that the text in general moves from being a kind of survival-like guidebook. I mean, we forget that the Puritans are coming to a place where the land is hostile. These are not people trained in survival skills. People are dying all the time, and they really are using the Exodus story to have this like real hope. Right? It's like they're making this really radical bet. Of course, the founders in 1776 are making their own kind of radical bet. But for them, it's not a matter of physical survival so much as they're using the Exodus more as an explicit political guide, right? As a matter of political survival. One of the things that they really emphasize, the Exodus story is really central in the founding to the idea that, okay, we disagree on a lot of stuff, but we can't achieve liberty on our own, either as individual humans or as individual colonies. So we need to work together as the ancient Israelites did, even though they had lots of differences and questions and conflicts among them. So it becomes a really sort of more a political guidebook as opposed to like a spiritual salvation survival guidebook.
It seems like the authority of the pastor during the Puritan era, the religious authority, which leads me to another question. Please be ready for your questions in just a minute. With your questions is, Moses bringing the Decalogue down from Mount Sinai. Is there and there's the natural law in the Ten Commandments, there's a clear definition that the Lord is offering of the human person and obligations to one another. But is there a sense of inalienable rights and equality?
Well, I do think it's important that the Exodus story isn't a story that grounds politics in the idea of rights. Particularly, this is underappreciated about Locke, thinks that rights come from a creator.
The appeal to heaven.
The appeal to heaven. And so it's hard to understand. I think it's easy to caricaturize Locke and rights if you don't understand that Locke himself was working within a tradition of thinking about that adding that language into a kind of interpretation of the Exodus story.
That's great. I'm going to just ask one more question, so then we're going to turn it to the audience. So Jay Heiler on the opening night on Wednesday talked about how the British reaction to the Declaration, and he talked about the long and detailed response that King George commissioned, including Bentham's part in that response. What was the response, particularly to the founders in Britain, in opposition to this use, if you know it, or if there was one, to this use of Scripture? They took the moral high ground. They took the narrative high ground, as you talked about, which is a brilliant rhetorical strategy. But was there a scriptural theological response to that moment?
I think there are moments of scriptural response. Thomas Paine in Common Sense refers to the Exodus story a couple times, and probably there's more response to Thomas Paine in particular, to his usage, because so many of the sources that I'm talking about are really homegrown, domestic, not for British consumption. They're sermons, they're newspaper articles, they're poems, they're songs. And so I think the truth is that the Brits don't see a lot of this. And it's part of why I'm interested in Exodus, because it is this very homegrown tradition that emerges over time. But there is, and I think that, so you see some response to Paine, but not really. I think mostly the British response is something along the lines of these people have always been religious loons, and they've gotten their liberty because they've inherited this great British tradition of liberty. I don't know what they're talking about.
You're already free. What are you talking about? Yeah. Well, I'm going to turn it over to the audience, please. Questions for Susan? And you can raise your hand, or you can come up to the microphone if you'd like. I see a few colleagues coming up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barndt. I was on a walk one summer a couple years ago, and in those little libraries in people's yards, I grabbed a copy of a book, and it was about a woman named Sojourner Truth, and it was from the Coretta Scott series of American Heroes, and it was a volume for junior high students. And I plowed through this book on my porch in an afternoon, and was weeping. And I asked myself, why have I never heard of Sojourner Truth? This is ridiculous. And so I kind of had two questions. One is, it strikes me that there has been, or there seems to be, an effort to eliminate a lot of the great stories of African Americans or other diverse individuals from our past, and what their contributions are, as well as their appreciation for the freedoms offered by this country. And so I don't know if you have a sense for that, if you could speak to that. And my second question is, what resources do you see out there that you could recommend to educators? Thank you.
That's a great question. I often think that there's a kind of paradox of our time wherein we have access, all of us in our pockets, to so much knowledge, so many historical documents. This is no longer the age of Donald Lutz, where you have to travel all over, the East Coast to obscure historical societies, to microfiche, information. And yet, in so many ways, and I see this in my children's own education, people work with fewer and fewer and fewer sources. I think there are ways to explain that, though I think it's more interesting to think about the fact of that and what we do in the face of that fact. I like to design assignments where I send students out to find forgotten figures. You don't need like anything more than pretty superficial Googling skills to start looking for forgotten founders or, hidden stories. And I mean, I work with like late age teenagers, so any that time you say like, there are things out there that you haven't been taught, right? Like they love that, right? Like they want to know where the secret information is. Some of the particular sources that I use is that there are databases of early African American newspapers in particular. I often send my students to those. They're online, they're often searchable by word, so you can, and there are also like broader sites of like early American newspapers. So I sometimes do assignments where I say like, okay, find a real-time response to the Declaration of Independence. Find something within the month that this happened. What were people talking about? And it has the bonus of teaching students how to do that kind of research. I mean, I frankly think that one of the things that happens is as we take for granted that students have access to all of this information on the internet, we've actually really relinquish much of our responsibility for teaching them how to find it. And what I've seen, and I teach very like high-level college students who come to college, not knowing that there are many more forms of research to do besides like Googling, right? And so that to me is something that, well, maybe we'll think about it next year, given the theme of this conference. But I do think that finding like particular historic databases is a really good way to go.
If the founders viewed themselves as embodying this Exodus journey, was there an American moment that they saw as symbolically like the Sinai moment of divine epiphany? Was it like when they signed the Declaration, that was like Moses ascending the mountain or something like that?
I mean, different American, I don't know about the founders so much. I do suspect that given the nature of the debate between Franklin and Jefferson, that they thought the Declaration moment was like a key moment, like an articulation of the principles, which they could have been thinking of as a kind of Sinai moment. But it's kind of fun if you look through American history, different people have been figured as Moses. One of the, I think, like most poignant moments in American history is during the March on Washington. And during the March on Washington, the president of the NAACP gets on stage. He's not scheduled, and he announces to the crowd that W.E.B. Du Bois has died. And a woman in the crowd yells, "It's just like Moses. He was not meant to see the promised land." And so those kinds of moments are very interesting, especially I think in the history of Black politics. There has particularly been an emphasis on charismatic male leadership in that Moses model. And so that's where I really see that really picked up as opposed to in the founding moment itself.
Hello, I think I'm the only British person here, so I can tell you I'm definitely having a reaction to all of this.
Thank you for speaking on behalf of your people.
Represents. Yes.
We're grateful for the tradition of liberty you handed down to us.
So actually, secondly, from a Jewish perspective, actually, I was wondering about the way that the narrative is interpreted by the founders, in the sense that I think a lot of the Exodus story deals with the fact that the Israelites are an unruly mob, and it's not necessarily so aspirational. The first generation dies in the wilderness. It's only the children that get to go to Israel. And also, Moses, I think, is not a natural leader. So how did the founders deal with that? Because it's not the most positive picture sometimes.
I think that's right. I think that was actually important to them, the messiness of the wilderness, the conflicts in the wilderness, the phenomenon of people who didn't necessarily have their sons killed, lose their property, lose their money. The founder from my of people who have a deep theological, religious conviction, and whose belief that God opposes enslavement in particular is the thing that allows them to keep hoping and fighting and living in the face of enslavement, in the face of oppression. Yet there are other people like Franklin and Jefferson to whom I don't think that is really important at all, to whom I think they appreciate it as a really good story that can be read by people. You can't take the God out of the Exodus story, but you can appreciate many of its lessons and appreciate, many of its stories without necessarily being devout in your belief. And so I think it really varies.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is sort of similar to the last one, but I'll try not to make it redundant. I was thinking about the point about the classics being abused. And that there can be sort of opposing sides making use of the same imagery and the same narratives. And I was thinking about John Brown or, other radical abolitionists who take Old Testament law as a genuine sanction to make war against against a community that, he believed was grossly misinterpreting a text. I was wondering if you could speak to, for him and certainly for other people throughout history, those images were not neutral. And the question of interpretation was quite dire. How important do you think the war over interpretation has been historically, and how important is it now when we think about the Bible and other classic texts?
Well, I think in general that the war over interpretation is politics, right? Especially in the United States. Part of the reason I think it's so important to teach students literature and hard literature and great literature, and my own definition of great literature, great books, and I took this from one of my colleagues in religious studies, is that it's literature that can legitimately sustain multiple interpretations, that different people can come to the same text and see different things, and yet, work together in conversation to try to negotiate it. Part of the reason I think that our increasing failure to engage students in that kind of exercise is that is the work of citizenship, right? Taking the material of the world, taking the stories and interpreting them and trying to converse with people about our different interpretations, trying to see the ways that our different interpretations might conflict, might be able to work together. And so in the end, I think part of what I like, in fact, about teaching Exodus and the history of American political thought is it shows how you can have multiple interpretations and yet still be connected by certain kinds of words or stories. That's effectively what America asks of us, to be committed to a set of words and stories and to work on the tough business of interpretation. And so it's why one of the reasons when people say a literature is important for democracy because it teaches people to empathize with other, I don't think that's actually right. I think literature is important for democracy because reading literature involves interpretation, and in so developing our own agency as readers and as interpreters.
We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, so we'll take maybe 2 or 3, or if there's shorter questions, maybe 4 more questions, but we'll see how we do here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, some of my question had been taken before, but I was curious about, you tracked this through line of Exodus through American history up until Du Bois, and then even you mentioned the March on Washington. Are there other texts, classical texts, that have a same kind of consistent through line through American history? What other texts kind of spring to mind that you can kind of track that progress through American history?
I think there are a lot of them. Exodus is my fave right now. The Odyssey is obviously one. In fact, the scholar at Notre Dame, Patrick Deneen, has a new book coming out called The American Odyssey, which tracks different tellings of Homer's Odyssey and retellings. It includes a chapter on Huck Finn. So the Odyssey is, I think, clearly a text that shows up again and again. There are other biblical stories that show up often. You could probably track the story of Job, pretty easily. Jesus is one, right? Like the story, you'll see that a lot. And beyond, I think beyond the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, you see a lot of Greek stories. I've really come to appreciate how central Greek plays are in, so you get a lot of Sophocles, you get a lot of Oedipus. There's a whole new series of plays by a guy named Luis Alfaro, and I'm blanking on what the name of I think he calls it the Greek trilogy, and it's retellings of Greek plays set in like Chicano, LA. So you see a lot of retelling of Greek plays in theater and in film, and a lot of Aristophanes too, Shakespeare. Yeah, I mean you can really, and I bet you could design some pretty fun assignments, like with all of those things. I often try to point out, my daughter just read, actually they didn't read Romeo and Juliet, they watched the Claire Danes movie of Romeo and Juliet. And I said, not every retelling just calls itself Romeo and Juliet. Like, what are the other Romeo and Juliet stories? And you can find them. So, so much of American literature is a kind of conscious reworking of past literature. I think you particularly see that in the 1800s, where there's this like earnest attempt by people like Washington Irving and to develop an American literature, and often that involves like playing with or creating sort of new mythologies that like mess up, right, ancient texts in some small way that in their mind makes it distinctively American.
My question was actually very similar to his about which other stories from the Old Testament should be told in schools that help show that civic education. And you mentioned Job and Jesus, and I was just curious if there was any other suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, you'll get Cain and Abel a lot. I think Cain and Abel, it's like a nice dramatic story. You'll see that a lot. I think in general, like the stories in Genesis appear again and again, and they're pretty short and they're pretty easy to teach. That would be my go-to recommendation.
I have a very high-level question. I want to know what happened to the end of the seal story, because we do have one.
We do have one. Yeah, so they... Right, so they table it, I think in August 1776, the Continental Congress is like, you've wasted enough time doing this, we're not doing this anymore. And they don't come back to the Great Seal, I think until the 1780s. And it's in the 1780s that the current design gets made, and it's by somebody who's kind of hired out to do it. And everyone's like, yeah, it looks good enough. Right?
Maybe we could start a movement to bring the old one back.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you. Born and raised in Bergen County, New Jersey, so rock on Jersey. Yeah. This may sound like a consulting question, but if you were to create a curriculum for, let's say, 6th through 8th graders, what would be 2 pieces of primary sources that you would want them to know in their learning of U.S. history? Because you mentioned some poems in your presentation, you mentioned some songs. But if you had to pick 2, what would they be?
So 2 examples from U.S. history of this?
Yes.
I would probably choose one of the slave spirituals, because I think, you can play them, you can sing them, you can have kids who know how to play instruments, bring them in and perform them, and there you've got a whole host of choices. What else would I pick? I would probably try to pick something called Martha, and the story is about a poor 14-year-old girl who God comes to her and is like, you're going to be the new Moses. And she's like, I don't really know. And she makes God a tuna fish sandwich while it's happening. And it's like Octavia Butler loves the Exodus story and uses it all over the place. So I don't know if I think that's 6th to 8th grade, but I might look for a short story of that sort. Zora Neale Hurston might be another one who would be good for that age, depending on, how good readers they are.
Well, Susan, is there anything else you want us to think about before we wrap up? Wonderful responses to the questions and great talk.
I just want to say thank you all for coming, and thank you guys again for arranging this.
Invite Carol back up.
Thank you again to Susan for that wonderful way to bring together all of our classical learning and the discussion of the American founding and the Declaration of Independence. And for stepping up and helping us bring Symposium home at the end on Friday morning. I'm very, very grateful. I just have a few last announcements before we go to our final sessions of the morning and of Symposium. We've had a little bit of there was a power outage last night, so if any of you have had any trouble with your parking meters, please open the Symposium app and go to important information to find parking meter code. And if you're having trouble finding it, go to the registration desk. If you have any trouble with the parking meters, go to the registration desk. And thank you very much for your patience. I don't know, there was a power outage, so there you go. I just got that message on my phone to read to you. So, just a reminder: please fill out the survey. We really want to know what you think. We want to make Symposium better and better and better every year. Also, if you need a professional certificate, please go to the app under the notifications and request the professional certificate, or ask again at the front registration desk. And please just remember to come back next year. We love welcoming you here to the Tempe Mission Palms and to Symposium in Arizona. We love this community that we're building, and we think that it's important for the future of K-12 education excellence in the classical world. And finally, please join us in the courtyard for coffees and pastries. Visit the sponsors, visit Eighth Day Books, our pop-up bookstore on the courtyard, and join us again next year. Thank you to all of you.